Conor McGregor spent years telling anyone who'd listen that Jon Jones couldn't hang with him. 8 knockouts to his 19, he'd say. He'd find a way to beat him, easy. And he'd throw Georges St. Pierre on the same breath while he was at it. Jones never argued back. He waited. Then McGregor's comeback fight lasted 69 seconds, and Jones finally said what he actually thought about where McGregor stood in this sport. People brushed it off back in July. Nobody's brushing it off now. This is that whole story, start to finish, and how it ended up being one of the most quietly accurate reads in the sport this year. Every fighter who's ever laced up gloves has had to decide how loud to talk before the sport decides for them. McGregor built his whole career on getting that math right, promising the finish before the bell, and delivering often enough that people stopped checking his work. He'd called shots against Eddie Alvarez, against Jose Aldo, against half the roster, and he'd backed almost all of it up with a fight that ended exactly how he said it would. That track record is the whole reason anyone still listened when he talked this way about a fighter as decorated as Jon Jones. It's also the reason nobody wanted to be the one calling him out on it in public, because the last few people who doubted him out loud had ended up on the wrong side of the highlight reel. So this is the story of the one prediction he never got to cash in, and the man who called it months before anyone else was willing to say it out loud. Back in early July, days before his comeback fight, McGregor sat down for an interview and went scorched earth on more than one rival at once. He tore into Khabib Nurmagomedov first, dismissing an entire Hall of Fame run as nothing, framing Khabib's lack of knockouts and his avoidance of weight class risk as evidence Khabib had no business being mentioned in the same breath as him. Then he turned to Jon Jones. He pointed straight at the numbers. By his own count, 8 knockouts for Jones, across a career most people call the greatest the sport has produced, and 19 for himself, though independent tallies actually put Jones's knockout total closer to 11. He said he understood Jones's greatness, and then immediately set it aside, insisting he'd find a way to beat him anyway. Perhaps even more telling than the claim itself was how he said it, flat, certain, like it wasn't a boast so much as a fact he was just getting around to stating out loud. It wasn't framed as banter for a press run. It read like a man settling a ranking in his own head and inviting everyone else to catch up. The clip spread fast, the way anything with McGregor's name on it tends to, and most of the reaction treated it as classic Conor, the same act that had sold pay-per-views for a decade, rather than a claim anyone needed to seriously weigh. And Jones said nothing back, no tweet, no interview clapback, nothing that would have made a headline of its own, even though headlines are the one thing this rivalry has never struggled to generate. For a sport that runs on rivals shouting past each other for clicks, that silence stood out, because Jones wasn't ignoring McGregor. He'd been down this road with him before, and he already knew how it tended to go. 10 years earlier, when McGregor pulled out of UFC 200 press duties and effectively retired rather than show up, most of the sport treated it as a tantrum. Other fighters lined up publicly to take his spot on the card. The internet treated it as the end of an era, the beginning of the end for a star who'd flamed out on his own ego. Jones didn't see it that way. He went on record backing McGregor's decision, calling it a man standing up for what he believed was right, respecting a fighter who'd stood his ground, even when it cost him money and headlines. He said flatly he didn't think McGregor was actually done. He was right. McGregor came back bigger than before, and inside a year, he was the first fighter in UFC history to hold 2 belts in 2 divisions at once, a run that made him the biggest draw the sport had ever produced. So when Jones went quiet this time instead of firing back, that quiet meant something specific. He wasn't dismissing the trash talk. He was waiting to see if the fight would answer it for him, the same way it had the first time, just in a direction nobody watching wanted to consider. That fight was supposed to be the reset, 5 years away from the octagon, a broken leg finally healed, a rematch with Max Holloway waiting on the other side of it, the same man McGregor had already beaten by decision back in 2013 when both were barely established. McGregor only 2 fights into his UFC career, and Holloway still years from becoming a champion himself. The 5-year layoff also meant McGregor had missed an entire evolution of the sport, passing him by while he sat on the sidelines, doing commercials, and living off the fortune from the whiskey brand he'd already cashed out of. Holloway himself wasn't some overmatched veteran waiting to be a stepping stone either. He'd spent the years since that first meeting turning himself into a featherweight champion in his own right, and the UFC's all-time leader in significant strikes landed, fighting the best the roster had to offer, even when it cost him, including a lopsided decision loss to Charles Oliveira just months earlier in a bid to defend the BMF title he'd worked years to win. That detail got buried under the comeback narrative almost entirely, because a 5-year layoff makes for a better headline than a fair breakdown of styles. Fight week itself leaned all the way into the reunion angle too, with McGregor working the cameras like he'd never left, and barely a question in any press conference about whether 37 and 5 years removed from real competition was still a version of him that could compete at this level. The UFC built an entire pay-per-view around the idea that Conor McGregor was back, and back meant something close to the version of him that once held 2 belts at the same time and sold out arenas on his name alone. In a sense, the whole card was a bet that 5 years hadn't cost him anything he couldn't get back with one big performance under the lights. But the signs were there before he ever walked to the cage. He hadn't competed since breaking his leg against Dustin Poirier in July 2021, a leg that snapped clean when Poirier checked one of his kicks in real time on pay-per-view. He was 37 years old, an age where most strikers are already managing decline rather than chasing a peak, especially strikers who rely on the kind of explosive, high-risk shots McGregor has always built his highlight reel around. His last actual win, against Donald Cerrone, was 5 years and 2 losses old by the time he stepped back in against Holloway. None of it slowed the hype down. Ticket prices climbed into the stratosphere. Fighters lined up on camera to predict he'd win, some of them clearly saying what the moment wanted to hear, rather than what the numbers supported. The story wrote itself before a single punch landed, because McGregor's whole brand runs on belief, his own and everyone else's, feeding each other in a loop that gets harder to question the bigger it gets and the more money sits on top of it. Even people inside the sport who should have known better got swept into it, because it's a lot easier to sell a comeback than to sell a warning nobody wants to hear. And that's exactly the story nobody in the building wanted interrupted. Not the UFC, who needed the biggest name in the sport's history to still be box office after years of will he or won't he. Not the broadcasters, who'd sold the fight on nostalgia and a 5-year wait rather than on current form. Not the fans, who'd waited half a decade and weren't interested in doing the math on his age and his layoff before the walkout music even played. Everyone in that arena had a reason to want the comeback story true, and reasons like that have a way of drowning out anyone saying otherwise, no matter how quietly they're saying it. It's the same dynamic that swallows every big return in this sport, right up until the cage door closes and the story has to hold up against an actual opponent instead of a highlight reel. Saturday night, T-Mobile Arena, McGregor finally walked out to his own hype for the first time in 5 years. Every camera in the building found him. Every sportsbook had already priced in a show. Whatever was actually left of his skills after half a decade away, this was the fight that would answer it, one way or another. Because after this, there'd be no more hiding behind "he hasn't fought yet," no more layoff as an excuse, just tape that either backed the hype or didn't. So, quick one before we get into how that actually went. If you want more breakdowns like this one, without waiting on an algorithm to feed them to you, we've started putting these out on Spotify as well. Links in the description. It's free. Go give it a follow. Anyway, round 1. It barely got started. In the opening seconds, McGregor came forward and threw a jumping switch kick at Holloway, the kind of shot that's supposed to end someone else's night, not the thrower's own. His right leg buckled the instant he landed on it. He tried to keep circling anyway, out of instinct more than any real plan, unable to put weight on the leg he needed to stand on. Referee Mike Beltran let it play out for a few more seconds before stepping in and waving it off at 1:09 of the first round. A torn ACL, a torn meniscus, surgery to follow, and a recovery timeline that puts his fighting future somewhere between uncertain and unlikely. And here's the detail that makes it worse. This was the second time in 3 fights that McGregor's own body had ended the night before an opponent could really do anything about it. The leg break against Poirier came from a checked kick, an opponent's counter doing the damage. The knee against Holloway came from a kick McGregor threw himself, landing wrong on his own aggression, with nobody else's hands involved. 2 finishes, 5 years apart. It's the kind of pattern that gets a lot harder to write off as coincidence the second time it happens. And a lot of the people who defended him after the first one went quiet after the second. Other fighters didn't hold back afterward either. Islam Makhachev, Jake Paul, and a handful of others took aim within hours of the fight ending, treating the injury less like like bad luck, and more like proof of something they'd suspected all along about where McGregor's body and his style had left him. What happened next made Jones look like the bigger man if you didn't look too closely. In the weeks after the loss, in an interview with Ring magazine, Jones praised how McGregor had handled the fallout. He talked about McGregor publicly leaning on his faith instead of spiraling into the rage and bitterness that would have been the easier, more human reaction. He talked about respecting a man who could stay steady while the entire sport laughed at him online. He said McGregor had already won in the ways that actually mattered, and that he hoped McGregor kept letting his light shine instead of giving up on himself. It read like an olive branch. It read like Jones putting years of trash talk behind him for good, choosing grace over the last word. And plenty of outlets ran with that framing alone, calling it a touching moment between two rivals, the kind of clip that gets clipped and shared without anyone reading past the headline. But that was only the polite half of the answer. Weeks later, asked directly whether McGregor could beat a genuine top-level opponent in the octagon, Jones didn't hedge, and he didn't pick McGregor. He picked Ilia Topuria, fresh off his own first career loss at the White House card, a fighter coming off a defeat of his own, and said flatly that Topuria wins that matchup. No qualifiers attached, no softening for McGregor's name or his history, and no acknowledgement that he was even being asked to weigh in on a legend rather than a regular contender. The same man who'd stayed silent through months of McGregor ranking him below fighters with a fraction of his resume had finally answered back. He did it by ranking McGregor below a guy who'd just lost for the first time in his career, which is about as clear a statement as a fighter can make without raising his voice at all. That's the gap between what Jones says to be kind and what Jones actually believes. Both were true at once, and neither one cancels the other out. McGregor's character, his faith, his handling of a horrible night in front of a sold-out crowd, all of it real and all of it praised sincerely. And underneath that, a completely separate verdict on where he now sits in the sport, delivered without any of the softening Jones had extended just weeks earlier. Jones has never needed to raise his voice to make a point about anyone. He just waits until the point makes itself, then confirms it in a sentence, and moves on without repeating himself. It's worth remembering Jones has spent plenty of his own career being written off too, suspended, stripped of titles, counted out more than once, and came back to beat nearly everyone the sport put in front of him anyway. Maybe that's exactly why his read on McGregor carries the weight it does. He knows what it looks like when the doubt is earned, because he's lived on both sides of that question himself. Add up where that leaves McGregor, and the picture gets hard to argue with. One win in his last 5 fights. Cerrone, back in January 2020, sandwiched between a submission loss to Khabib before it and back-to-back stoppage losses to Poirier and now Holloway after it. None of that is a knock on what McGregor built earlier in his career. The 2 simultaneous belts, the pay-per-view records, the fights that genuinely changed how the sport marketed itself. It's simply a separate question from whether that version of him is still the one walking out to the cage in 2026. Jones wasn't reading tea leaves back in July. He was looking at a record everyone else had agreed not to look at too closely, because McGregor's name still sells more tickets than his current form has earned in years. That's the part that actually stings if you sit with it for a second. It was never really a fight prediction. It was Jones telling the sport what its own record book already said, months before McGregor's knee said it too, in front of a sold-out arena and a pay-per-view audience that wanted a comeback story instead of a warning. He'd been right about McGregor once before, back in 2016, when everyone assumed the walkouts and the retirement talk meant McGregor was finished, and Jones said no, he'll be back, bigger than ever. He was right that time too. Nobody wanted to hear him the second time around, because the first time, being right about McGregor felt like good news, and this time it didn't feel like anything close to that. 2 predictions, a decade apart, both about the same man, and both of them landed exactly where Jones said they would. Whatever comes next for McGregor, whether that's one more run at a title picture or a slow fade into legend status, the sport now has to reckon with a version of him that its own biggest star already saw coming and said out loud, twice, a decade apart, while everyone else was busy selling tickets to the opposite story. Nobody wanted the warning in July. By August, it wasn't a warning anymore. It was just what happened, on tape, in front of everyone who'd bought a ticket, hoping not to see it. If this is the kind of breakdown you come back for, following along means you won't miss the next one when it drops. And there'll be plenty more, because this sport never stops handing out receipts on the things nobody wanted to believe.